Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Rice Jewish Studies webinar. We're so excited to have with us Kenneth Hoffman and Anna Tucker from the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans. My name is Dr. Joshua Furman. I'm the curator and founder of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University. For those of you unfamiliar with the archive, just briefly, it was a project that we created here at Rice in the wake of Hurricane Harvey to collect, protect, and make accessible historical material about Jewish life in Houston and the South Texas region. And as of today, we have over 150 physical collections of historical material about Jewish life in Houston and other cities and towns in South Texas. We also have a website and a Facebook page and an ever-growing catalog of digital material. And I'm just going to briefly show you, for those of you who have never seen it, our website, which is here. And you'll find it at jewishstudies.rice.edu. And here's where you can find more information about the archive, what it is that we do. Here at the library guide link, you'll find a catalog of our collections, as well as some more information. And here we are on Facebook. If you haven't already, please do like our Facebook page so that you can stay up to date about new and exciting collections that we've managed to acquire. It's a really exciting era, I think, in the world of Southern Jewish history. And the Houston Jewish History Archive is just one institution in a really vibrant network of historical societies and university archives and museums that document and teach about the Southern Jewish experience. And so we're so honored and excited to have an opportunity today to get an insider's perspective on the new Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests today, starting with the executive director of the museum, Kenneth Hoffman, who's really become over the past year a treasured colleague and friend. Kenneth was born in Houston and raised in Baton Rouge. He earned his BA and MA in history from Tulane University, and he's worked as a grant writer for the New Orleans Museum of Art and the curator of education at the Louisiana State Museum. From 2004 to 2006, he was president of the Louisiana Association of Museums, which he led through the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Kenneth recently ended an 18-year tenure as the Director of Education at the National World War II Museum, which he helped to open in June of 2000. And he lives with his wife and their two daughters in the Black Pearl neighborhood of New Orleans, and wants you to know that he doesn't eat at Camellia Grill nearly enough. Kenneth, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm
Thrilled
also
to be here.
going to quickly just introduce, before I hand things over to them, Anna Tucker. Anna is the curator of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. She graduated from the history program at Berry College and received her MA in history from Georgia State University with a research focus on immigration and Jewish studies. Prior to joining the MSJE, Anna served as the special projects curator for the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books at Kennesaw State University and was a member of the executive team overseeing the Museum of History and Holocaust Education, Bentley Rare Book Museum, and the Zuckerman Museum of Art. One last note before Kenneth and Anna begin their presentation. As attendees of this webinar, you can send us questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you type in those questions, they will be viewed and moderated by our team here at Rice Jewish Studies and sent to me. And the final 15 to 20 minutes of our program together will be answering audience questions. So please don't be shy. Send us those questions as they come to you. And with that, Kenneth and Anna, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josh. Really appreciate it. And Anna is going to be running a little slideshow. I'm going to talk about a few things, and she's going to talk about a few things. I would like to first thank Rice University and the Jewish Studies, the department, and the Houston Jewish Archive for inviting us to share what we hope you will find to be very exciting the opening of a new museum in New Orleans dedicated to telling the story of the history and culture of Jews in the South. And when we say the South, we mean a 13-state region, which I'll show you in just a minute. But to begin with, we always like to have a little fun. So we're going to do have a couple of quiz questions. We're going to do a Southern Jewish pub quiz. And I believe this picture is from when I did a presentation for Mobile, Alabama, because I think this is an Alabama craft beer. I guess I should have put a Lone Star. I'm not sure what y'all's favorite beer is these days from Texas. I'm sure there's plenty. But let's go to our first question. And our first question is, which city had the first synagogue outside of the original 13 colonies? Was it Charleston, South Carolina, Mobile, Alabama, or New Orleans, Louisiana? If you want, you can type your answer into the Q&A, but since there's really no prizes, it doesn't really matter. So in your heart or in your room, raise your hand for what you think it is. And Anna, let's show them what it is. The answer is New Orleans. That's right. Of course, Charleston was in one of the original 13 colonies. Mobile has a very rich and old Jewish history. And New Orleans and Mobile have a little competition about who has the oldest Mardi Gras. And actually, the answer to that is that Mobile has an older Mardi Gras than New Orleans. But New Orleans is home to Touro Synagogue, the oldest, 1828, the oldest congregation outside the original 13 colonies. Question 2. Which sweet treats trace their kosher roots back to Savannah, Georgia? Is it A, Girl Scout cookies, B, Goo Goo clusters, or C, pecan pralines? So type your answer if you wish, or just shout it out to the Zoom universe, and let's see what the answer is. Girl Scout cookies, that's right, because when the Girl Scouts were founded, 3 of the first 4 troop leaders were Jewish women in Savannah, Georgia. And when they started selling cookies nationally for fundraising, they went to the best bakery in town. It was Gottlieb's. Gottlieb's was a kosher bakery. And so ever since then, they've made efforts to make all Girl Scout cookies kosher. Question number 3. Which African-American musician was taken in by a Jewish family at age 7 and given his first instrument? Was it Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, or Buddy Bolden? And I'll give you a clue that that first instrument was a cornet, which is sort of like a trumpet. So let's see what the answer is. It was Louis Armstrong, taken in by the Karnofskys, a group, a family of immigrants from Lithuania. And he lived with them for a couple of years and rode on the back of their rag wagon going through town, and he would toot on his little horn to call attention. And for the rest of his life, he wore a Jewish star necklace in honor of the Karnofskys. So just 3 little factoids to tell you that Southern Jewish history is also American history. All right, let's see what's next, Anna. So about the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, we're opening in early 2021, downtown New Orleans. If you're familiar with New Orleans, we're not too far from the World War II Museum, where I used to work. We're on the streetcar line, so it's really easy for tourists and locals to get to us. This is our building. We don't have the whole building. I wish we did, but we are occupying part of, we have the entire first floor and half of the second floor. So it's about 13,000 square feet, but it's in a beautiful renovated building, and we're moving in new exhibits next week, as a matter of fact, that have just been fabricated. Very exciting. Next. So is this a new museum? You may have heard of this museum before and be thinking, I've heard of this museum before. Well, it was originally founded at Henry S. Jacobs Camp, which is a Reform Jewish summer camp in Utica, Mississippi. And it was started by the camp director there, who saw that the small town Jewish population was disappearing very quickly. This was back in the 80s. And people were calling him and saying, we're the last Jewish family in Cary, Mississippi. We're the last Jewish family in Krotz Springs, Louisiana. We haven't had a rabbi in 40 years. We're selling the building to the Baptist church. What do we do with the Torah? What do we do with the Ner Tamid? What do we do with this and that? So he said, well, the camp can be a repository for all of this history. And then he decided, well, let's just make a museum to share that history. And it was a great place for the summer campers to learn about their heritage. I used to go to this camp when I was growing up, but it was very inaccessible. It wasn't easy for the public to get to. And so a few years ago, they shuttered the museum. They took all of the collection and put it into storage and set about looking for a new place for it. And of course, that new place turned out to be New Orleans. So let's see what's next. So we found a great location in an old building. Here's some pictures of some of the old building. It doesn't look anything like this on the inside now, except that we've maintained as much of the original brickwork and the exposed beams as possible. So it has a nice historic look inside, except it's not crumbling anymore, which is good. And there's electricity and there's plumbing, which is helpful to have in a museum. And we have been working very hard to get this place ready for the general public. And that, I think, is my portion of this presentation. And Anna, I think you're going to take it from here.
All right, thanks, Kenneth. So now we wanted to give a very quick overview about some of our opening exhibitions. And at any point, we would love for you to enter in questions to the Q&A so we can loop back and sort of dig in a little bit deeper to the history. But I heard that some of you might be museum studies students and also just generally interested in Jewish studies. So you might be asking, how on earth do you fit the entirety of 300 years of history across 13 states into 13,000 square feet? And the short answer is we don't. Instead, what we're focusing on are several jumping off points that spark conversations that basically make this museum a living museum where we have conversations, we dig in deeper to different topics. But one of the challenges that we had is what are the themes and the events that we include in this very tightly packed museum? So we worked with a team of over 30 scholars, one of whom is your very own Dr. Joshua Furman, to help build the themes and the events and the stories that are included in this museum. So when a visitor walks in, they first enter into our lobby retail area, and they are hopefully quickly and elegantly escorted into our orientation film. So this is a very quick overview about the questions that we hope people will ask as they go through the museum. So just jumping right in, what you're seeing right now is the first floor, and that's what we'll spend the most amount of time on today. The second floor also has changing exhibits, classrooms, offices. We can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A section. But what we want people to be able to do as they walk through the museum, sort of get a broad perspective of what is the chronology of Southern Jewish life in the American South. So as you enter into this first gallery, on Gallery A, you're introduced to some of the earliest settlers in the American South, and even before it became America. So we touch on themes of immigration, of how people and why people came to America, and specifically the American South. And then we also focus on how did people move from these port cities of Galveston and New Orleans and Charleston into the interior. And one of the big themes that we wanted to have throughout this museum are connections. So how were people connected to the transportation system? How were people connected to their neighbors? How were people connected to these bigger themes and events that were happening at the same time? So as you go through this museum, for instance, you'll enter into a section about the Civil War. And so we use this specific time period to be able to talk about themes such as Southern identity and racism and slavery. So we're a museum that wants to be a space of conversation and also approach some of the difficult questions that people have. So after you go through the section, you'll see right here, it sort of looks like a crooked square. This is actually our peddler's cart. One of the important factors of Southern Jewish life is also becoming a part of the economic fabric of the area. So we talk about peddlers throughout the American South. We talk about how peddlers often moved into becoming brick and mortar owners. So the merchant store up at the top will have original artifacts and also some props that make you feel like you're in a merchant store. So moving quickly through the end of this first gallery, this left-hand side where you can see it says becoming Southern and building Jewish community. Here's where we talk specifically about the social and the political environment of the South, which is different from place to place and from decade to decade. So we look at anti-Semitism, we look at politics, we look at women and domestic affairs within this area. We also look at the founding of religious communities, so establishment of cemeteries and that growth into actual physical synagogues and temples. So as you close out of sort of this first era, which roughly runs, our first entry is about 1585, runs up to the early 1920s, you go into this middle section, which is Gallery 2. And this is our foundations of Judaism. It's kind of Judaism 101. So it's for people who aren't Jewish or maybe they weren't raised observant. And we talk about some of the key components of Judaism. So the words and sounds of Judaism, holidays, life cycles. And we also wanted to make this a very interactive area. We can also talk about how we've pivoted a little bit, especially in light of COVID-19, how we can stay interactive and amidst this climate as well. So after you have sort of this island in time that is Gallery 2, you go back into the chronology of it. And you'll see right here in this entering section, it's entering a new century. So we talk a little bit about Zionism. We talk about the World War I, what people were experiencing, not just as Southern Jews, but as Kenneth said, as Americans within this environment. You'll see over here. Oh, yes.
Anna, tell them about the picture, the Dallas picture.
Yes.
I know this is Houston, but tell them about the Dallas picture.
That's right. So we actually have a picture, and it was helpful through the grandson, I believe, of Lou Toads, who was one of the founding members of the Young Zionists of Dallas. So we have this really great image. I think it's from circa, I'm going to say 1918 or 1919. And there are three individuals, including Charlie Bender, who became, I believe, the Zionist cowboy of Texas. And they're standing with a flag that has the Magen David, the Star of David on it. And it has Young Zionists of Dallas at the bottom. So this section definitely gets a Texas shout out, as do quite a few sections that we can talk about later. But I agree, Kenneth, that's one of my favorite photos in this entire museum. So as you're sort of moving out of the 1930s and into the 1940s, we have two sections, World War II and the Holocaust, and also civil rights and activism. This is where we have oral histories that focus specifically on Southern Jewish experiences during these time periods. So in the World War II and the Holocaust section, we look at Southern Jews who were soldiers, and we also look at Holocaust survivors who then became Southern Jews and immigrated after World War II. This is another section where immigration as a theme comes up, is very important. And then as you round the corner, you come around to civil rights and activism, where we look at civil rights within a broad perspective, but we narrow down with our timeline entries into Southern Jewish experiences within this. And then as you sort of come out of this section, you see transformations.
Tell them about the Houston photo.
Okay, that's right.
The
So the Houston photo, I know. Yep, the Houston photo. So we actually have an image that was helped source, I believe, by Josh Furman as well, of a 1969 rally for Soviet Jews held in Houston. In the background, you can see the Maryland car wash. So one of the sections that we look on is activism with Soviet Jews, and the Houston community was very active. There were several rallies that took place in support of Soviet Jews. So we have a very large life-size mural of the Texas Jewish community involved in that. So you'll definitely want to come, if only to get your photo in front of that mural. And so as we round out through the transformations of the South, we look at how the American South was transforming during this time period. So the sort of the twilight of smaller towns, but then the ascendance of these larger communities like Austin and Dallas and Atlanta. So we see this shifting understanding of what vibrant Jewish life looks like. We close out with a little section on Southern Jews and culture, ranging from literature to art to wrestling. And then you come to this middle section right here, which is a great opportunity for people to have a deeper dive. So we have a state-by-state map where people can actually explore individual towns, including throughout Texas, and see some highlights from our artifact collection. And other events that took place there. We also have the ISJL Encyclopedia, one of our key partners, where people can do a very deep dive into individual cities. And to close it out before I move on to the collections, and again, any questions that you have, I know this is like most rapid fire overview, just put them in the Q&A and we'll try to return to them. So to close out this section, we have creating a community quilt, where people can actually create their own quilt square based off of an 1885 Victorian crazy quilt that we have in our collection and on display. And people can think about their identity and their place within the community as they're literally stitching together their understanding of a community with the rest of our museum visitors. So again, you exit through the gift shop or the museum store, so to speak. And just for the last 20 seconds, I'm going to show you some renderings. Again, this is not exactly what our museum is going to look like, but you see there are several artifact cases here. I'm going to talk about the collection in just a minute, but having artifacts is essential for our understanding of Southern Jewish experiences. So you'll see this throughout. This is our gallery 2, where I was talking about the foundations of Judaism. Above here, if you see at the very top, there are actually stained glass windows. They're reproduction that were sent from 15 different synagogues across the South, including from Texas. They're actually hanging over some of our artifacts. And finally, you see gallery 3, a little bit more. We won't have a coloring book as exhibited here, though if you do have a historic Southern Jewish cookbook or coloring book, we're absolutely open to new acquisitions. Okay, so again, very quick overview of our exhibitions. We did want to talk a little bit about another really important factor of our museum, and that's our permanent collection. So as you can see on the screen, we have 4,000 artifacts and we are actively growing. We are not only a museum on display, but we're also a research facility and an institution where people can come and learn more in depth about Southern Jewish life. So we've put on here just a few examples to show you the range and the breadth of our collection. We have everything from that 1885 Victorian crazy quilt that I was talking about just a second ago. We have immigration documents from the 1800s into the 1900s, where you can trace people's experiences as they cross borders. We have a very large and growing photograph collection. As you can see here, there's an example of the Scher family, or the future Scher family, before they survived the Holocaust and came over. We also have several instances of business artifacts. So we have the Flower Brothers shoes. We also have the Hub shoe store. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with that name from Marshall, Texas. So we have business collection items that we're looking to actively grow. And then finally, we have some Judaica to also show that religious life. So in terms of the directions that we're hoping that our collection will grow, we are hoping to expand in business life, in religious life, in family and genealogical studies. We're also interested in immigration stories and citizenship. So any of these aspects that you have, especially if you have artifacts from Texas, we would love for you to contact us and we can start a conversation about how you might be able to become a part of the MSJE.
I have a question, Anna.
Yes.
I have a question. Will you take everything that I have?
Unfortunately, we will not be able to take everything that you have, but we will work with you on finding a good home for that. And sometimes the best home is with your family. So
Well, will you take a big stack of old crumbling newspapers? Sorry,
fortunately
just
does not fit within our collection scope. No,
just kidding.
Kenneth actually brings up a great point about museum collections. One of the things that we try to do is grow our collection so that it fits our research scope. And we have limited space, and we're also very rigorous with our preservation and conservation requirements. So the items that we accept into our collection, we have to be able to prove and attest to the fact that we'll be able to take care of that preservation. So crumbling newspapers, unfortunately, do not tend to have a home with us.
Okay. All right. I was just kidding. That's one of the hardest things to do for a museum curator to do, is to tell someone who wants to give something to the museum, thanks, but no thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Every museum has to say no thanks to some people. And there's, and most people understand, some people get a little miffed, but that's just the way it works. So next steps, the next steps are to get this place open. And because of COVID, and the economic issues and transportation issues surrounding that, we have had to delay our opening. We had hoped to open in 2020, but now we're going to open in 2021. We're hoping in the first quarter of 2021. So we're still just a few months away. We are looking for participation, meaning that we're looking for artifacts. We're looking for people to sign up for our, to follow us on Facebook, sign up for our newsletter, those sort of things. If people want to help out in other ways, there are volunteer opportunities as well. If you want to go to the next slide, that actually has a website, or our website, www.msje.org/contact. If you go there, you can sign up for our Southern Schmooze e-newsletter. Right now, we send it out once a month. We're not one of those people that peppers you. Once we open, we hope to send it out maybe a little more frequently, maybe twice a month, with stories from our collection, stories from history, announcements of virtual programs, and one day on-site programs at the museum. So if you want to follow the progress and be a part and learn about the museum, go ahead and sign up for our Southern Schmooze newsletter. And I think that's it. Is that the last slide that we have? So there you go. So we're finished with our yammering. And now I guess it's time to hear what y'all want to talk about and see if we can have a conversation.
Great. Thank you both so much for giving us that insider's perspective into how the museum is coming together and what the exhibits will look like, as well as a sense of what the central themes are. In a minute, we are going to turn to questions from participants. Please do feel free to keep sending them in. I see that there are a number of them already posted, and that's great. I think one of the things, that this talk highlights that a lot of people sometimes don't understand fully are the differences between a museum and an archive, right? And I think one of the things that's been great, speaking for me, is how we've been able to work together, the Houston Jewish History Archive here at Rice and the museum. So, for example, there was somebody who contacted us some time ago about a steamer trunk that I think it was grandfather had brought with him when he came through Galveston. We have no room to keep a steamer trunk in Fondren Library, right? It would sit in a vault in the back of the Woodson Research Center, and nobody would hardly ever get to see it. That's the perfect kind of artifact for a museum collection. And I'm grateful to know that I think it'll end up in New Orleans and have a really good home. Crumbling newspapers, however, we love crumbling newspapers. We will digitize your crumbling newspapers and then lovingly recycle them or lovingly return them to you. We are a research facility here at Rice University. You're also a research facility, which is really great. but you have, display and exhibit capacity that we don't have. And so it's really exciting to be able to partner with you. I wanted to ask just one or two questions before we turn to fielding some questions from people watching today. The first one is, do each of you have a favorite artifact in the collection? What is it? How did you get it? And what is it that you love about it?
Okay, I'll go. Well, first of all, that's a very hard question because I have probably 10 favorite things. The quilt is one of them that was mentioned. But one that was shown briefly, but I didn't say anything about it, was a golden bagel. It was in the second to last slide, and it says on it, Cru de Jus. And Jew is spelled with an I-E-U-X, kind of a faux French term. And it is a Mardi Gras throw. Mardi Gras is very big here in New Orleans and has been for centuries. But when Mardi Gras started, Jews were excluded. Of course, it's a big Catholic holiday, and Jews were excluded from the Mardi Gras clubs and balls. But now in New Orleans, there are two Jewish parading organizations, and one of them is called Cru de Jus. And they paint these bagels, golden bagels, and they put glitter all over them and shellac them, and they throw them while they're marching in their parade. And it's such a wonderful expression of Southern Jewish, or in this case specifically New Orleans Jewish culture. Yes, we have lots of things from 19th century peddlers, and lots of things from, naturalization papers from immigrants. But the Southern Jewish experience is a living thing. And this bagel, the way we acquired it was, I called up a friend of mine who is in Cru de Jus, and I said, we need a bagel for this museum to put on display. And they made one specially for us. So we have a lot of old things in our collection. This is one of the newest things, but it's evocative of the kind of things we're trying to talk about here in New Orleans. That's my answer.
I love that you chose that one. That's such an important thing that you bring about, that artifacts can be 6 months old. A lot of people think that they have to be monumental, some huge event that took place. But some of our most important artifacts are small diaries or cookbooks or things that you might perceive as sort of, unimportant or small or piddling. And so I would say also it's very hard to choose a favorite artifact. It's like favorite child, but it changes from week to week. But specifically for you, we'll bring up, we have a medallion from the Sanger brothers in Texas that is actually going to be on display. And Joshua, I also wanted to mention that the Shapiro trunk that you helped source through us will also be on display in our section on Galveston and internal migration. So huge thanks to you for making that connection. But one of the reasons why I like is this tiny little medallion. I mean, it's about an inch wide by, less than an inch tall. And it actually came from the Sanger brothers, who were a group of brothers who immigrated over a period of time from the mid 1800s Bavaria to eventually to Texas. And as the Houston and Texas Central Railway started making its way across Texas, the Sanger brothers, led by their eldest Isaac, started planning these stores, eventually becoming this fairly large conglomerate. They were sourcing goods from New Orleans and Houston. But of the brothers, I think there were 5 total who eventually came over. The youngest brother, Alexander, was like a PR firm's dream come true. He helped set up a Dallas State Fair and establish public libraries. And he also opened a night school for his employees. So this little tiny medal was one of the awards given circa 1910 to a student for quote unquote school citizenship. So we were able to source this from auction, which again takes a rigorous review to ensure authenticity and cross-checking to make sure that it's from a reputable source. But this little tiny medal suddenly tugs on all this history, like transportation history and transnational histories, immigration. And we are working with a local conservator because there's a patina on it that actually hides the relief on the front of this medal. So one of our roles as a museum is to make sure that we are preserving and conserving artifacts appropriately. So we're actually going to have this on display once a conservator is finished with it. And right now, just because I've been working with a conservator, that's my favorite artifact. So.
Great answers. Yeah, I also find that, sometimes we don't conceive of things that are, relatively recent as being of historical importance. And of course, that couldn't be further from the truth. So there are a number of interesting questions coming to us in the Q&A venue. Some of them are, do you have an exhibit on, or do you have a section on the Galveston storm? There's somebody watching today whose ancestor lived through and survived the Galveston storm, and so that may be an interesting.
Yes, I want that grandmother's testimony. You person who wrote that question. Let's see, who was that?
Yes.
Was that Betty? Absolutely. We'll give you our contact information and we can start sharing things. Yeah. Absolutely, Betty.
And I think we have a small, I want to remember if we're mentioning, I think Isaac Kempner at one point, and also our state-by-state exhibit goes into deeper dives. So this is exactly the type of information, like send us your stories. And again, might not make it into the museum, but that's, something very important to us.
Very good. There's a question about how the layout of the new museum will differ from the original museum at Jacobs Camp.
Okay. Well, you may not have been to the original museum at Jacobs, or you may have been and not remembered it. The original museum had hallways down the side, and the center was an auditorium that the campers would use for both for Shabbos services, as well as it was one of the only air-conditioned buildings there. So summer in Mississippi, it was very popular. And then on the hallways, they had cases with artifacts, and they had, labels and text panels and photographs on the wall. So I will say this with love in my heart, it was somewhat old school in that it was a presentation of these items and a description of them. Museums have come a long way from the 1980s. And so our new exhibits are much more interactive, meaning there are opportunities to push buttons and see things and explore things, touch things when appropriate. And they are presented in a way that is, has sort of a story arc to it, a chronological, at least the chronological exhibits, a chronological story arc. So you're going to be walking through history as you walk through the museum.
Okay, very good. On that theme of museum design, can you talk a little bit? You mentioned this, Anna, in the presentation, and Kenneth, but how has your vision for the physical exhibits been affected by the pandemic? What kind of re-envisioning of either the space have you had to do, or how visitors are going to interact with your artifacts?
That's a great question. And again, this is an ongoing, conversation. As information and practices become available, we're implementing them in real time. But one of the primary shifts that we have is we love being a hands-on museum, and hands-on is not necessarily something that we want to, be right now. And so one of the shifts that we made is we have these flip books that have details about individuals and events in towns. So for instance, in the merchant store, you can walk up and learn about the Hub Shoe Store in Marshall, Texas. And so originally people were going to turn the pages like a page of a book, but we've shifted to a digital touch screen where you will touch it with a stylus and not with your hands. And one of the benefits is it's safer for us. And the other benefit is you can actually fit in more stories that way. So, that's something that, and again, Kenneth is in ongoing conversations about how we make these museum spaces safe. So that's just one example of a shift that we've made.
Okay, great. There was a question that came in about, one of the central topics in Southern Jewish history, as you mentioned, is the disappearance of small town Jewish life over the past several decades. And our work here at the Houston Jewish History Archive to some extent reflects that. We have collections from towns such as Wharton, not so far from here in Houston, where there was for um, almost a century a small but very vibrant and tight knit Jewish community. And I know I think Fred Zeidman is watching today. Hi, Fred, from Wharton, and a lot of great folks, and some other towns. So how does your museum, tell the story of small town Jewish life? What artifacts do you put on display to do that? And what other projects are you aware of, that are being done in these communities, which in real time continue to go through the processes that you talked about? We're the last Jews in this town, and the synagogue is closing. What's the museum doing about that?
Well, this takes me back to my days in graduate school at Tulane University when I wrote my master's thesis about the Jews of Port Gibson, Mississippi. And when I wrote the thesis, there were 4 Jews in Port Gibson, Mississippi. But in the early 1900s, there were more than 120, and they dominated the downtown. Everyone else was a farmer growing cotton mostly. And they were the merchants, but then they became the mayors also, and they, built the schools and were very involved in the civic and cultural life of that small town. So I used Port Gibson, Mississippi as a case study for what was happening or had happened in a lot of small towns. The reason that they disappear, or the Jewish community disappears, is that the third or the 4th generation goes away to college. This is a generalization. They go to Vanderbilt, they go to Tulane, they go to UT, they go to Rice, and they get a degree, a professional degree, and they turn around and they look back at their small town and their father's or their grandfather's little store, and it's just not for them anymore. It's hard to keep them down on the farm once they've seen Houston. And so that today the South has more Jews than it's ever had before. They just happen to be in Atlanta and Dallas and Houston and Charlotte and Miami, but not in these smaller towns. So there has been a transformation, and Anna talked about that gallery or that exhibit called Transformations. And so we talk about that exact experience. We have a series of photographs that were made back in the 1980s by a very wonderful photographer named Bill Aaron. And he made a book called Shalom Y'all. And it was all about small town Jews, mostly in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, but a few other places as well. So we will be displaying many of those old black and white photographs. One of the things we display, it's one of my favorite pieces. Again, I know I already talked about favorite, but it's a proclamation. It's a piece of paper from Lake Providence, Louisiana, little town across the river from Vicksburg, Mississippi. And it's from 1954, is it? Somewhere right around there. And the proclamation is from the mayor, and it says, in memory of Ray Stockner, a citizen of our town who has passed away, all stores in Lake Providence will be closed on this date between these hours, while the funeral is going on, because she was such a citizen of this town and beloved by all. And it's a wonderful, honor to her and her community. That's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to be separatist. We're not trying to just talk about the insular Jewish communities, but we're trying to show how Jews in the South were part of the communities. Sometimes they were kept away from being parts of the communities, and we talk about that too. But any object or any story that connects the Jewish population with the greater population and combines Southern and Jewish, that's the things that we most love to explore. All right, that was long-winded. I'm done.
And Kenneth, he covered it. In terms of other resources, I think Joshua, like you said, we're a network. So Institute of Southern Jewish Life has an encyclopedia that they are actively adding to. So that's information where it's text-based, but you can add digital history there. Joshua, I know that your institution is also actively collecting, including paper-based documentation. And I think that one of the most important things that we preserve is a digital record. So even though, as a museum, we wouldn't be able to take the structure or, something that's too large for us to take care of, please send your photos and your memories and your stories. We have a place on our website where you can share your stories. So go there, contact us. We'll try to help you get in contact with other institutions because these histories are essential for understanding and we want to actively work to preserve them.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, they're absolutely essential. I agree, and it's great that we're all partnering together in this work. There are a couple folks who have raised their Zoom hands, and I wanted to point out that in this webinar I can't call on you to ask a question. So if you want to ask a question, you'll have to type it into the Q&A window, and you can access that window at the bottom of your screen. If we can't get to your question, you can always communicate with us after this webinar is over. We won't magically disappear into the ether when the session ends. We're here and we're eager to connect with all of you. I wanted to talk, we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. For so many of us in the year 2020, the issue of racial justice and sort of coming to grips with the legacy of slavery and racism in American history has really come to the forefront. And this is a narrative that Southern Jewish history actually has a lot to comment on. Can you, and I teach a course here at Rice on Black Jewish relations, which I'm actually teaching this semester. Give us some insight into how your museum talks about Black Jewish relations in the South through various exhibits and artifacts.
Sure. Actually, yeah, absolutely. You can't talk about the history of the South without talking about, you can't talk about the history of America without talking about race. It is the blanket that covers everything. But one of the things the museum is hoping to do is to expand somewhat that understanding of Southern history beyond just the dichotomy of black and white. There were these other populations in the South that add to the vibrancy, the intrigue, all that such. So we have two main areas: our Civil War and race area in Gallery 1, and we talk about that Jews were slave owners, and some Jews were slave traders, and we have some newspaper ads from the antebellum period of Jewish slave traders or runaway slaves from a Jewish owner, and we put those up there. We spent a lot of time trying to phrase things the right way. We don't want anyone walking out of the museum thinking Jews didn't own slaves. We don't want anyone walking out of the museum thinking Jews controlled the slave trade, as some anti-Semitic people have put out there. So there is very good scholarship that's being done and continuing to be done, and folks we've worked with in order to present the story as history, as it happened, warts and all. And there are warts on Southern Jewish history. So that's one area. The second area is in our civil rights and activism area. And in the South, during the civil rights movement, there were different responses by Jews to the civil rights movement in different areas and at different times. In many, many cases, there was silence. That silence came from fear of speaking out, fear of being identified as different and therefore being a target. Sometimes it came from straight up racism. And then there were examples of Jews. Now, we all know about the Northern Jews, the Freedom Riders, the young people or the rabbis that came from other parts of the country to fight for civil rights. But there are also stories of rabbis and civic leaders in the South that stood up for civil rights. So we talk about Rabbi Charles Mantuban in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and Perry Nussbaum in Jackson, Mississippi. Who his house was bombed by the KKK because of his outspokenness for civil rights. So there's two areas where we mostly cover that, and I'll let Anna did the most work on our script and working with all of our historical advisors. So I'm going to give her a chance to add what she wants to say.
Yeah, and you gave a great summary of that. And I think a key takeaway is that there were diversity of perspectives. And so one of the things that our Southern Jewish Experience Museum does is break up this idea of a monolith of a Southern Jewish experience. So Southern Jews did not always speak with one voice or were one type of person or had one background. And so in this incredibly important conversation, this is an area where this comes out. And I was just trying, like, as you were talking, I was thinking back through our specific exhibitions, and Kenneth mentioned the Civil War section, and we have a note about Leopold Karpeles, and he and his brother Emil immigrated from Prague, I believe, and they went different directions. Leopold was involved supposedly with the Underground Railroad, whereas when Civil War broke out, his brother joined the Confederacy, and Leopold joined the Union as a flag bearer. So I think this is a museum that looks a lot at context and influence and also choice, the different things that go into making those choices. And I also think that an important thing about this conversation is we don't just relegate it to two areas. We include talks of racism and racial relations throughout the museum, and how that is involved in, building communities, and how that's seen today. Our civil rights timeline goes all the way up to 2017. So this is, again, an ongoing conversation, and we want to hear people's perspectives. We have written the script in collaboration with community members and scholars, but everyone's a part of this museum's narrative. So as you come in, the script isn't finished, even though it's on the wall. We want to continue working it and rewriting it and understanding it as each new perspective comes in.
I love that statement, that the script isn't finished, that Southern Jewish history is still being written. We're all living it right now.
And my guess, I'm just guessing here, my guess is that folks who come in will have opinions. I'm just spitballing here.
Great. We're gonna try to go till about 1:05. So about 8 more minutes. So there's still time if you want to send us another question or two, try to get it in under the wire, you can. I wanted to ask about, the relationship between a permanent exhibit and sort of rotating exhibits. Can you tell us about, you gave us an overview of what I think, or I assume is the permanent exhibit, but what ideas or plans for rotating or temporary exhibits do you have? And will any of these exhibits travel, or are they all going to stay in New Orleans?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we're working on developing. So the permanent exhibition is, as you say, the words are there on the wall. However, we are going to be rotating out artifacts even within our permanent collection, just because we're showing 80 to 100 artifacts out of over 4,000. So as people come in, we want to provide new perspectives that are seen through these artifacts. So that will continue to shift through the lens of artifacts. But for our changing exhibit gallery or special exhibits gallery, this is an opportunity to do deeper dives into specific topics. So it could be food waste, how does the kitchen and recipes really boil down into it. And I know Marcy Cohen Ferris is having a Southern Jewish Historical Society event coming up soon that's very exciting. It's also an opportunity to look at things like industry. So Marnie Davis wrote a work on literally called Jews and Booze. So we might have a special exhibit related to that. But this is a great opportunity for also us to co-sponsor and co-curate with other institutions. So I think an exhibit is stronger with more partners. So we'll work with other institutions, to have temporary loans, so that other special artifacts can come in and be on display. And as for traveling, I mean, that's a Kenneth question, but I think we're open to almost anything right now.
I have nothing to add, but I would like to answer, somebody asked in the chat or the Q&A about what we consider the South. And our museum covers 13 states. If you're a history buff, I can tell you that it's the 11 Confederate states, if you know what those are, plus Oklahoma and Kentucky. So that's what we consider, that's what we're interpreting. And my very first virtual program was with you, Josh. And the question was, what's Jewish about Texas? Or no, what's Southern about Texas Jewry? And we talked about, well, there are these intersections, and is Oklahoma the South? And is South Florida the South? Full of folks from from the Northeast. And how come you're not doing Maryland? Kentucky, does that count? So these are all valid questions, but these are the states that we interpret and work with. So that's to answer that person's question.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. I sit on the board of trustees of the Southern Jewish Historical Society, another great organization in our field. And we had a very spirited debate over the summer about defining what is the South. And there was a proposal on the table to include Maryland and Delaware, and even perhaps I think Southern Ohio, like Cincinnati, came up for a vote. And so, to some extent, these things are moving targets, right? How do you define the South? How do you define the Jewish South? The other one is always, Florida. Is Florida part of the South? Is Florida its own world? And then even within Florida, right? You have Jacksonville and you have Miami, and there's different places.
Right.
And
Right.
there's no one.
The panhandle is very southern, and even the middle of the state, and then the southern part, is very different. And yet there are some very interesting things happening down there with Cuban Jews. There are stories about rum running during Prohibition. That some Jews were involved with. So there are great stories down there, even though they're not the same as the stories from Arkansas and from Alabama.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we're only got a couple minutes left, but I'm wondering if you can talk about the extent to which your museum is able to document the experience not only of Ashkenazi Jews, those of us from Eastern Europe, but Sephardi Jews, and also what about Spanish speaking Jews? How are their stories being told?
And Jews of color too. We're living in an age where it's very important to recognize, to break out of some of the circles that we're most used to or most comfortable with. There are a lot of populations that can be part of Southern Jewry. So, but I'm going to let Anna take it because this is her thing.
No, that was one of the intentional conversations that we've had in terms of representation, because Ashkenazi and Sephardi life is vibrant in the American South throughout its history. So even one of our very first map that we have looks at Sephardi immigration to the American South. But we also don't end it right there. There's sometimes this impulse of starting with a Sephardic story, and then it shifts almost entirely to Ashkenazic stories. But one of the things that we do is in our section on building Jewish communities, we look at waves of immigration, including around the late 1800s and early 1900s, where a lot of Sephardi communities were immigrating. And how that actually played into these conversations about what type of temple do we have, what languages do we use. Actually, during our Foundations of Judaism, we have in our words and sounds, we talk about Ladino. And how, it's not just Hebrew, but Yiddish and Hebrew and Ladino, they've all become part of this, tapestry or this quilt of Southern Jewish experiences. So that's something where, I think that representation is important and needs to be intentional. And, we want to hear more Sephardi stories. Without question, our collection right now is representative of a predominantly Ashkenazic collection. And so that's an area that we would like to hear more about.
And anything that comes to you, Josh, from from Brownsville or from Corpus Christi or from anywhere where there's a big Spanish influence in the Jewish community, anything that comes your way that you don't want or that doesn't fit your archive, give me a call.
I'll give you a call for sure. I want to thank you, Kenneth and Anna, for spending time with us today. This has been such a fascinating conversation. And next year in New Orleans, as they say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I make sure?
We're all going to meet. We're all going to meet. Now, where can I get the best beignet in town?
You go down to the French Quarter and go to Café du Monde if we're touching each other by then.
Or even if we're not, we can enjoy a socially distant beignet.
That's right.
And coffee, and then a tour of the museum. Well, I am so excited to come and see the museum in person, and to bring groups of Rice students to New Orleans to be a part of this. It's really, again, changing the way that we learn Southern Jewish history, that we teach Southern Jewish history and preserve it. And I couldn't be more honored to be a part of it and to be working with you and to be proud of all that you've managed to achieve so far. So on behalf of everybody watching, thank you again so much. And we hope you'll join us again in a few weeks. We're having another webinar here at Rice Jewish Studies about the film, This Is Our Home, It's Not for Sale, which is a documentary made in 1987 about the history of Houston's Riverside Terrace neighborhood, a neighborhood that went from being predominantly white and Jewish in the 1940s and 1950s to being predominantly African-American in the 1960s. And so it touches on a lot of really important issues related to the Southern Jewish experience. And we'll be joined by the director of the film, John Schwartz. That's going to be on Thursday, November 5th at 3:30. Look for more information coming about that. Kenneth, Anna, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.